You're on. I'm Richard. I'm alcoholic.
Hi, Richard.
Let's see. Let's get the first things out. The only qualification I have to be up here is that I haven't found it necessary to drink or do drugs since July 21st of 1997, which was probably one of the worst days of my life. And we'll get back to that. I have a sponsor. He has a sponsor. I work with people. I try to, volunteer and try to do other things as much as I can. That's basically that part of it. So I was born in Indiana, very middle-class family. Never wanted for anything. We had a good childhood. If there was one problem, I had 4 older sisters. But, that didn't really lead to any spoiling because of, it just didn't. Because at one point in time, my mother said that, if you're going to pick on him, get it done early because he's going to be bigger than you. And my sister got smart with me and I broke her nose. And so that kind of took care of that. But anyways, the thing is that, get-togethers and everything else. My father was a functional alcoholic. He drank heavily. My grandfather did too. By functioning, they never got fired or anything like that. They always, were good wage earners. They owned companies. But it did kill him. My grandfather, when he was 80, and my father, when he was 66, of esophageal hemorrhages, which both are the same thing. So, a very nasty way to go. So alcohol was always there. My parents believed, they always had their cocktails at night. In the summertime, you're sitting out, and da-da-da before dinner. And, it was just, like I said, there was never any problems or anything like that. It was always good. First time I got drunk, my parents had a 25th anniversary party. My Uncle Larry, when I was 8 years old, kind of filled me up with champagne. And I passed out, and my parents put me in bed. And they took a picture of it because they thought I was such a cute drunk. And I think I wanted to prove to them that I wasn't. But, that didn't set anything off. It wasn't like that was like I found Nirvana or anything like that. My basic, really only remembrance of it is that they had this picture that they would show people every now and then, and so it was kind of in certain ways embarrassing, but anyway, so, just that. When I was, 13, 14, a young teenage person, we started, trying to, me and my friends decided, it seems like it would be fun to take some of this to the football game or anything like that. We would take soda bottles either from my parents or his parents, and it was like everything clear this week. So you would try to fill up a soda bottle with vodka, gin, whatever clear liquid there was, or another week would be whatever brown liquid. And we would go out back of the stadium and chug it down before a game, and all was fun. I knew, though, that we started having a tolerance when we started. One time we were doing this, and another person wanted to join us. And so we went out and we're chugging these bottles, and there was a dance in the gymnasium afterwards. And we wanted, it was all of a sudden, well, where's Tim? And next thing we know is there's chairs at the bathroom, and there's Tim on the floor vomiting. And so we're sitting there going, oh, we really didn't feel really anything, But, that was start of the, that was, at that point, was the trigger, And I started doing alcoholic things that my parents never taught me. When I was in 8th grade, they found a bottle of Jim Beam in my bedroom. Now, me being the smart, which I stole from them, but me being the smart alcoholic person that I was, I also put I had a poster board in there, and I drew the bottle on, and I said it was an art project, and I was using the bottle. This isn't their teaching. This is all the stuff that I come up with on my own. I also in high school I had a bad skiing accident, and I had to have surgery on my leg. And back then they just tore your leg up when they did knee surgery and stuff. And I was in a brace for a long time from that. And it took me a while to learn how to walk again. It also introduced me to painkillers, which, this is AA, but alcohol was the first thing on the table, was the last thing to leave for me. But so while other kids were trying marijuana, I'm doing Demerol. And it was kind of funny because then they would go, well, let's try to smoke this weed. And I'm sitting there going, this is nothing. You know what? There's a lot better drugs out here than that. This is my mentality. I was voted in my class most likely to buy Budweiser. That's probably isn't, not the most successful or anything like that, and do that. And we lived out in the country, and it was different times. And, with us and the buddies in the car drinking and doing whatever, we've been pulled over by cops, and we never got in any trouble. It was just kind of like, go home and do this and that and the other thing. But with me, and this is really kind of funny, when I got my driver's license, since I had a bad knee, I kept the cane in the car. And I just had that, I told my parents in case something happened with my knee. But I did get pulled over once, and the cops wanted to give me a field sobriety test, and I got out and pulled the cane out. And they couldn't give me one. So they ran me downtown and did the blood test and a breathalyzer, and guess what? I was drunk. So at 19, I had my first and only DUI. Back then, I got a good attorney and basically got a slap on the wrist. I lost my license, I think, for 30 days. My judge argued, my attorney argued to the judge that, and I don't know how they came up with this, that it would be too much on my heart if I had to go to jail for a weekend. That my heart couldn't handle it. I have no idea, but the judge bought it. And so they sentenced me to spend a weekend in a detox facility. And I went to I actually drove myself to the detox facility, got out, and I was there 4 hours, and the counselor called me back and said, here, I'm signing all the paperwork. I want you to get out of here, because I was just arrogant and disruptive. I was making fun of the attendees in there and everything else, and he said, it's not your time. You'll know when it is. Signed the papers, and I went, whoo-hoo, I got off. And I'm gone. I did. I went to college. Again, drinking, progressing. Business school for some idea. I got this grand idea that I should get married. Now, I couldn't take care of myself, not let alone, and I did, and I got married. It was. We were both very young. It was doomed from the start. I remember that I asked my mother one time, this was hilarious, I forget what I asked her for Christmas. And I got a set of luggage instead, and with a card saying, you never know when this will come in handy. So, that's kind of, where her mind was. My mother was was never, she just put it out there. Let's just put it that way. So anyways, right at this time, too, is when my father started having his serious esophageal hemorrhages. And I quit my job, went down to Florida, taking care of her, left the wife up, but, and I was going back and forth to Florida. And it was during this time period that, my mom looked at me and basically said, I know you're unhappy. I know you went to business school for your dad and blah, 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 blah. Why don't you? She goes, I'll pay for college for what you really want to go to. And I went to culinary school. And, of course, my wife did not go with me. She was just kind of like, it's bad enough when you're around, for her to be around me all the time. with her family there, let alone drag her off to some other city. And I got to culinary school, and it was great. I was at home. I mean, I could take a bartending class at 7 in the morning and actually use real booze and have a martini. Some of the chef instructors owned bars across the street. It was, but I excelled at it. I got a job with a corporation when I was there, a hotel corporation. Continued on through graduation. At this time, too, I knew the marriage was over. And my wife actually was living with another married man. And his wife lived in Nashville. It's a long, convoluted story, but anyways. Anyway, so, it's time for the divorce, and this divorce kept dragging on. And I decided at one point in time, I knew his wife, and I said, well, I'll just speed this up. And I called her up and said that, your husband is sleeping with my wife. It's not like they're sharing a house together or anything like that. And she said, I knew that, you just confirmed it, but thank you, and hung up. Shortly after that, she committed suicide. And what that did to me was, it just made me feel like I was a horrible person, didn't need saving. It was, time to off the races. I could, it gave me an excuse, and I know today and through therapy, I didn't cause it. You just can't, she had a lot of issues going on, and that's how she chose to deal with it. And it's a very selfish way of dealing with it. But anyway, so, I'm off to the races here. At the same time, this is, but it did, I'll say this though, it did, the divorce ended then. We got the divorce done, for the wrong reasons. But I'm working in Baltimore and stuff, and at this period of time, Vegas decided that they were going to make a big transition and make it into a family town. And they were building hotels left and right, they were, themed hotels and stuff like that. And, I don't know who put the name in or whatever, but I got recruited to go to Vegas and to go to a large casino out there. And I decided, me, Vegas, sounds great. And I went out to Vegas. It was a pressure cooker, but, I found some dry goods out there that kept me awake and permitted me to, and this was the main thing about it, it allowed me to drink as much as I wanted to forever. And I would never pass out. It was just amazing. And, I'm out there. This would tell you the type of crowd I'm hanging with. I actually moved out in the country for a little bit, but it was too far out. And I had to be down where the action was, and I moved to close to downtown. The bar that I hung out at when I wasn't at work was called The Office. It was a cinder block building. It had no windows. It was frequented by Teamsters, and late at night, it's where the working girls would go settle up. So it was quite a clientele they had there, and I was at home, and so one day, I'm working there. This is some years have gone by. I'm out there and doing. I don't know, I manage. I've always been fortunate that, for some odd reason, there was plenty of chances for me to get fired, and I just kind of made it through. It was just, like this close and nope, and kind of like with Baltimore. I think actually with Baltimore, some people are just like, well, let's they need a person, let's give him to them, and they receive, so he's not our problem anymore. But anyway, so I had to be down where the action was, and one day I was walking home from the grocery store, carrying my groceries, and got shot. I was collected up in a drive-by shooting. It was not a near lethal wound or anything like that. I got it right in the ass.
That's lethal.
God looked out for me. Inches, seconds, It was, and, it was shortly after that, I'm sitting there thinking, that, Vegas really isn't, this isn't working out for me. I get shot here and stuff like that. And so I'm putting feelers out for another job, and I'm there at my bar that I hang out with, and one of the working girls go, "Boy, have you ever thought of Minneapolis?" She goes, "It's really beautiful up there." And that's all the validation I needed to buy a plane ticket to go to Minneapolis. I went up there. I went up there in the middle of winter. You know how hard it is to find a winter coat in Vegas? And it's kind of funny because it's just like the big book says. I got off the plane. Minneapolis has a huge airport. I don't know how many, hundreds of flights are in there and how many people use cab, but I found a friendly cab driver, and he decided he was going to be my tour guide. And he would come and pick me up, and and he would show me the sights, and he found me an apartment. We went out and found an apartment, did all this other stuff, and I'm like, I guess I'm moving to Minneapolis. Of course, this whole time that I'm doing this, I'm just hammered to the bejesus. I never figured out that Minneapolis wasn't open 24 hours a day, and they actually didn't serve booze on Sundays. You couldn't buy liquor, so, from 24/7 to this. But anyways, I go back to Vegas. This tells you how insane my life is that at this point I have given up my driver's license. I didn't lose it. I just let it lapse. And the reason is that I was drunk all the time, and if I got arrested, they would put me in jail, and I wouldn't be able to drink there. Not because if I could kill somebody or all the right reasons, it was just a self-protection mode. And so in Vegas, I was taking cabs and limousines everywhere, and so up here, I had my cab driver. And I went back down to Vegas. I needed somebody to drive the moving truck. So somebody suggested this guy who I found out, about an hour and a half into it, that he was a heroin addict. And, and we were stopping, we're in a truck stop, and all of a sudden I realized that he kind of overdid it. And I'm sitting there going, oh, geez. And I found out after a couple of phone calls that people were actually placing bets on where we would get arrested at, on the trip up. And, didn't get arrested. I moved into this apartment. And, like with Bill's story, I had all the intentions of getting work and everything. And I just couldn't do it. And I stayed drunk for 2.5 years. I had one, it was there was a woman that I was a friend with who was a friend of the working girl down in Vegas. So and she was a crack addict, so it was a great codependent relationship. So there was that, and my cab driver for a friend. My cab driver would come and pick me up every now and then. I used to call them air-out rides. He would just put me in his cab, like roll down the window and show me sights. And I would have a bottle under the seat and be pulling out every now and then. And my cab driver every now and then would say, if you ever want to stop, I may know some people. But this is just that's how my life went. My apartment, I had blankets over the windows. I really didn't want to see sunshine. And I just, if there's one good thing about it is that it completely, drinking over a liter of bourbon a day will cure you of all other dry goods. I had no other cravings except for alcohol. So I'm up there, and I'm smart. Back then, you had to pay for caller ID. This is right when caller ID came up. I didn't have an answering machine, but I paid for caller ID. That way, if you called me, I would just see that you called me. And it was my ID. Oh, you called? Because it was kind of a novel thing. Most people didn't have it. So if I ever called the person back, it was like, oh, you called me? Oh, that's a surprise. And I've trained myself. I never answered the phone or called somebody after 10 in the morning because I never knew what shape I was going to be in. I would wake up in the morning. I always take a little bit of booze, but wake up in the morning, I remember looking in the mirror and saying, I'm not going to drink today. And then within 3 seconds, go, who are you kidding? Get your shoes on, let's go to the liquor store. It got to a point that walking down the liquor store, the apartment, I thought this was really great, the apartment that my cab driver found for me had a liquor store right next to the grocery store. And I thought it was really convenient that they put food by the booze. And I was embarrassed to call my cab driver, but I was at the point that even walking the 4 blocks to the liquor store was too much, that I would call the cab company up. I didn't want to call my personal cab driver because I was just embarrassed to be doing that. But I would call every day. And you had to say your phone number when you called in, and as soon as I would say the number, the lady on the other end would go, well, are you going to the liquor store or the bank and the liquor store today? And for 2.5 years, I basically literally liquidated assets and stayed drunk. Right close to the end of the 2.5 years, the nastiest thing happened. Most of my family lived in Florida and southern states. I look back on it. I went to Minnesota to hide and die because 7 months, at least 7 months out of the year, none of my family would go up there. But my sister was married to a Dane, and I got a call that some shirt-tail relative, they wanted me to show them around town. Well, yeah, I've been up there 2 years, but I never left the apartment. I didn't know it's just like, oh my God, and all my lies are coming, like, oh shit, here we go, So anyways, these 2 kids from Europe, they're not kids, they were in their early 20s, and they want me to show them around, and I called up my crackhead friend, and and she told me a few bars and things like that. And so we went out at night bar hopping, and we closed down. I remember the bar was the Caboose. And I always thought that was a funny name for the bar, the Caboose. But anyways, it's closing time, and they're going, okay, let's get back to the apartment. How do we get there? And I'm going, I don't know. I'm lost. To this day, I do not remember how we got home. Only thing I know is we did make it. The next day, they flew out of town, and but it started off this cascade effect of, the gig was up and I just remember thinking that maybe all these outside things aren't the problems, that the problem's me. And I couldn't get that out of my head. That was it. So I called up my friendly cab driver, and he was kind of shocked. And he was like, really? And it ended up that he has he was an alcoholic, but he had 2 daughters that were drug addicts. And so he was familiar, and so he called up his oldest daughter, who called up her boyfriend that was in AA. And I'm a product of a 12-step call. The boyfriend sponsored, another guy came over to my apartment. And they told me how it was, what happened, what it's like now, and all that good stuff. And started saying the process about it. And I'm sitting there going, in my mind, going, well, wait a minute. I just have a little drinking problem. You're talking about some really serious stuff here, what and I said, I told him that I think I'll go see a psychiatrist. And they wanted me to go to me, and I said, no, I'm going to go see a psychiatrist. But he left his number, and I never threw that number away. And for the next month, I broke all records drinking. And I finally had enough, and I called him. And his first question was, have you been drinking today? And I was like, well, yeah, you know. And he was like, okay, well, we'll start tomorrow. Now, I called up my cab driver again, and he came and got all the booze out of my house, except for the one guy was from Denmark, and they had this liqueur they drink called aquavit. And I knew because I permabuzzed myself that I was going to go through shapes and everything else. And so I kept that so I could have nips on it, so I could hopefully temper myself, so I wouldn't, stroke out or whatever. But anyway, so I kept that. And shortly after that, there was a really bad thunderstorm, and my apartment building was a bunker, and all the power lines were underground and everything else, and nothing happened. There was a huge thunderstorm and power went out my building. And, I sat there in the dark, and finally it was time. I went down, I'm taking my nips off the aquavit. I went down and met my new sponsor, who at this point I didn't know was my sponsor, and he took me to my first meeting. And I can't tell you anything about that meeting, really. I mean, I got in the room, and I remember being there. But after the meeting, it was at an Alano Club, which is kind of what this is, but had a lot of different meeting rooms and meetings going on constantly. And I went downstairs, and there was this guy there that was my sponsor Kurt's friend, Frank, and he had this weird expression. And my sponsor went and got me a big book, and Frank looked at me and said, all you needed to know was the first 3 words of page 112. Which I'll let you guys look that up. But I looked at it and saw that was, I would tell you, the first 3 words are read this book. And I thought to myself that, the world would probably be a better place if I just took Frank out. I was not in a joking mood. I was, my aquavit was gone. I'm starting to wig out a little bit, And so the next thing I know, my sponsor believed in, that you need to socialize. You just can't go to AA and do that. So he drugged me to a Perkins. And a few minutes later, who walks in but Frank? And it was at that moment I kind of realized that my life as I knew it was over. And somehow this guy, Frank, was going to end up to be my friend. And that was the start of it. I went home, and this was the evening of the 21st now. My power's still out. It's like 100 degrees out, 100% humidity. I'm in bed, and it's still lightning and stuff. And I remember I said a little prayer of, God, it'd be really nice if you could put on the power so I could have a fan blowing on me or something, because I really don't feel very good. And I'm pretty sure he answered that prayer by saying, no, I want you to remember this. And I wanted the DTs. And I remember a lot of it. And I was, and it's kind of, semi-state for over a day. But I came, I came out of it. What happened the next day is that once I came out of it, my sponsor said to call him, and I did. And he took me to another meeting. And I got to this meeting, and this is when I found out that the benefits of being late to your first meeting is, they asked, is this anyone's first meeting? And it wasn't my first meeting, it was my second. So I didn't have to raise my hand. And also, I didn't want attention, brought to me, which, if you would have seen me, I did bring attention to myself. But, the thing is about, I'll say this, is about drinking, permabuzzing yourself for that period of time, and I basically was a hermit, is that, I lost all social skills. I could not read anything aloud. I mean, I could read, I actually thought I'd burn out the synopsis of my brain, that permitted me to read and speak at the same time. And if I spoke, it came out a mile a minute, kind of like a shotgun answer, and then I wouldn't say anymore. But, I started going to meetings, and my sponsor told me to call him every day, and I was desperate enough I did. My sponsor knew I didn't look, and it took me 3 months for me to figure out that every time I called him up, he said, "We'll go to a meeting." And I'll go, "Okay," and I would go. A lot of times he picked me up. Other times, I found other people to get rides on and stuff. And I was forced to start interacting with people. At this time, and it was really kind of funny. I still kept friends with my cab driver. And he was an avid golfer. And so he was like, "Well, what are you doing with all your time? Let's go play golf." And so I went and got a cheap set of clubs, and he started, taking me out. He was a very interesting person. He was a multiple felon, spent time in Leavenworth. But he was actually a really good guy. And he was, at this point, he was getting close to 80. But anyway, so, we would go out and play golf and stuff like that. And, I started doing the steps. And I'm a smart person. And I got myself really hung up with that because of, it says, in step 2, it says, we came to believe that, but in step 3, it says that we're going to say who that is. And so I'm putting that in front of it. So before I could come to believe, I got to figure out what I'm going to believe in. And I was a good agnostic, and I'm driving myself nuts. I'm watching Stephen Hawking's universe, doing all, just stupid stuff. And I remember I was about 3 months sober, and I was sitting there was a park by my house. I was sitting out there, and it just came to me and said, everything I ever tried failed, and here I am, I'm sober. And so therefore it has to be something besides me. It has to be power greater than me. And that was the crack that I needed. That opened the door up. And, to this day, I still say as God, as I don't understand him. I think people put too many humanistic traits on God, and they think that the who created the universe can, is at the same plane that we are, where he or it isn't. He is the creator of the universe. So, it's all above my pay grade. And that was really important because of it. It allowed me for the first time to say, I don't know. Where before I always, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, you baffle them with bullshit. That was kind of what my MO was, and I was able to say that, and, after time with that, things started getting better. And it did. And started playing golf and stuff like that. And in a city that side, there was a huge amount of people that were newly sober. And like this guy Frank and I one time, we found out that, it's really not a good idea to go set off a rocket next to a fire station. That they may have something to say about that. But I mean, we're just doing we were having fun being sober, and some of the stuff we were doing was quite stupid. But, I was having fun. It's just at this period of time then, it's kind of funny is that, here I am unemployed and everything else. But there was this girl that had 6 months more sobriety than me. And she found out I played golf, and one day said, "You want to go play golf?" And so we started playing. We weren't dating or anything. We just started golfing on the weekends. And she met my cab driver, and he gave her a few golf lessons. It was kind of funny. But, the thing is that, we ended up getting married. But we found out, we found out we liked each other before we did it. It was the first time I ever did that was, find out about a person before you go sleep with them, so we started dating right after I got a year. We started dating because my sponsor told me I needed to wait for a year. So anyways, our romance continued, and she had a house, and we decided at one point we're going to get married. And I'm unemployed still. It's amazing. I don't know what she saw in me, but so anyway, so I decided we were going to do this in college during the summers. I did some painting for beer money, and so I was actually a pretty good painter. And so I'm painting the house, and the reason she was from Connecticut, she moved to kind of Minnesota to hide too, from things. But she had friends there, and her husband was a contractor, and they were out for a walk, and she said, the lady said to Sally, said, Steve really likes Richard's work. I mean, he's a good painter. And Sally looked at her and said, well, Richard really needs a job, so he works for you. and it was kind of funny because I met with Steve, and Steve was like, well, I'm a small contractor. I can't hire you full time. But what he did was he introduced me to all of his contracting buddies, since he basically set me up in a contracting business. When we got married, it's kind of funny. I had my cab driver read St. Francis' prayer. Now, both her family from Connecticut and everything else, they were all kind of looking strange. Why? Because if you saw Jerry, he just didn't fit in with everybody else there. How does he know him? And why you have a cab driver, reading something, But it worked out. It was pretty funny. Jerry passed away many years ago, but he was a great source of amusement, and he actually saved me a lot of money in cab rides because of for many years. So, anyways, things, the business went well. Sally was working well. Blah 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 blah. Many years down the road, we came down here to visit friends in Pinehurst, and it was October. We went back, and it was 2009, and that's when the housing crash happened. My wife worked for the lumber industry. I was a painting contractor. Both our jobs are doing, and she looked at me. We went back. She goes, I'm not really happy here. Well, what are we waiting for? Let's move. And we did. Within 6 months later, we were here. We bought a house and moved down here. That's when I started meeting everybody here, doing that. I never went back into as big as a contractor as I was up in Minnesota, so we had time to travel and do stuff like that. My wife did some things to follow her dreams, and life was great. Then in 2020 was COVID, and right at the end of COVID, this is where it gets tough. My wife fell and found out a week later was ovarian cancer. And she passed away. The first thing I did when it happened, I called my sponsor. It was the middle of the night. He didn't answer the phone. But he woke up, saw his phone, something, and called me at 4 a.m, came over. Took care of things, and the very next thing I did was I came here. And I continued to come here. I can't say that, I got big enlightenment by coming here, but I knew I was safer. I can also say that God granted me the knowledge that for that period of time that I knew that drinking was not an answer. And I didn't have any temptations to drink. I knew that, everybody goes, well, it must be tough. You must want to drink. And I was like, no, I don't. But I also keep coming here because I know if I don't come here, that could be the temptation and that could be the answer. As I always like to say, the worst thing about people who don't go to meetings is they don't get to see what happens to people who don't go to meetings. When I was in one of the meetings I went to up in Minneapolis, had a lot of old timers in it, and young people didn't go there because they scared them. This was AA before the F word, feelings. There was more than one person they looked at and said, "You're not done yet. Go out and get drunk." I mean, they literally kicked them out of the meetings. People were hardcore. And I told myself I wasn't going to they weren't going to scare me off. But the thing is that you hang around with people with a lot of sobriety and older people, you find out that what they are dealing with is life. And they could teach you a lot on how to handle life. And I put that knowledge to use. It's kind of funny is that I get letters for grief counseling and things like that. And it's like, we have a meeting once a month. It's like the third Wednesday of the month, we have a 1 hour meeting. It's just like, that's nothing. But, I know everything's going to be okay. As I always say, my toughest days in sobriety are ahead of me because I made it through the last ones. I truly did. It's kind of funny. You look at, and I can look back at my life. As I said, with all the cab drivers and all the Minneapolis and everything else, I got the one that knew about AA and stuck around. And I don't think that's a coincidence. If it wasn't for him getting me to go out and play golf, I wouldn't got married. And if I didn't do that, I wouldn't be here. I'm kind of what I'm saying. It's also with the bad things that happen in my life. I mean, running away to places, or doing that. I still, it all got me here. I'm the sum total of all my pieces. And it got me to be very spiritual. I do believe in God. I always say to people that, and I do it for a reason, especially for sponsees, that I don't consider myself a Christian. And the reason that is that if I would walk in, say I ran into Frank on the street, we never met, we started talking, and somehow AA came up, and he said, "Oh, you're in AA?" And I go, "Yeah." And he goes, "What meetings you go to?" "I don't go to meetings." "Well, who's your sponsor?" "I don't have a sponsor." "Well, do you work the steps?" "Yeah, blah, blah, blah." He would walk away and say, "Not really in AA." Well, I mean, that describes me in the church very well. I don't go to church. I do have my dad's old Bible at home, but that's about it. And so who am I trying to fool by saying that I'm something that, I actually don't do. But I do believe in God. I believe in God's grace. And he's permitted me to be here, I could have easily been shot. I also should say that it's a funny story. I won't tell it here, but when I got shot, it was actually the second time. I had an incident with one of my best friends that who's now dead from drinking, fell and hit his head, and died of blunt force trauma. In fact, most of the people that I hung out with in high school and college are all dead now. I'm the exception. I'm at the age now of what my father was when he died. I used to jokingly say that, when my mom would send me stuff, and like you should cut down your drinking, your father died, and da 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 da. And I took that seriously and kind of said, Grandpa died at 80, my dad died at 66. If I quit by 50, I should be safe. you know, thank God it didn't last, you know, go that long. Who knows what had happened, but, that's how we think, you know,